Well, we finally have the official post and the patch. The patch is out for 25.4.3. So we can see what these nerfs are. There's only 3 cards that are being changed for standard, a couple of cards that are wilds only, and then some battlegrounds and duels changes, as well as a little bit of additional fixes, which we'll talk about the little like hot fixes as well. But they do talk about the card changes here. The first one, Construct Quarter, absolutely was way too powerful. So they did just change it up 1 mana. Personally, I would have liked to see this also be a 4/4 body and not a 4/5. I still think that's going to be pretty strong. Decreasing the uses, maybe they could have done that. But from my play, I feel like the third use, you'd never often play it. But yeah, I've seen people get to play this on turn 2, and that was just a little bit too much. So they did put it to 4 mana, and we'll see how that goes there. They do mention specifically Frost DK as being very strong, and this was the strongest card there. So we'll see how much this changes that with just being an additional mana. But speaking of additional mana, also Goldshire Null being bumped up to 11. This is the change that I think just makes the absolute most sense. It's kind of Goldshire Null a little bit kind of dying for Shaman's sins, I think. But at 11 for Evolved Shaman specifically, really you can't evolve this into anything else. It's just gonna evolve into another Goldshire Null. So pretty good change there. I think it will impact a couple other decks a little bit, being that additional mana, but I think some of those decks can still play it. It might just come out that 1 turn slower in those decks. But the big change here is how it's impacted with those Shaman Evolve cards. And it is rotating out in April-ish anyways, so we don't have too much longer with that Goldshire Null. And the third card relevant to Standard, which actually I think a lot of this is more so a wild change, but the Gray Sage Parrot now will only recast spells that cost 6 or more. This is more relevant for wild and not being able to recast Time Warp, but it might affect Standard a little bit, although at least more recently, the Standard decks that have been running Gray Sage Parrot really don't run any cards or any spells that cost 5. It's all spells that cost 6 or more anyways, so not really a super hard hit to Standard decks here. So definitely looking at some wild cards here. These are specifically only wild. They are not in Standard, but a couple of changes here as well, just to address some things that have been going on in wild. And there are some Battlegrounds changes as well. The big thing that I want to mention, I think, with the Battleground stuff is, for one, they do say Cinderai Straight Shot will now only appear in games with Undead, and that is the 3/4 that removes taunt or the taunt or the reborn effect when it attacks into a minion. So makes a lot of sense that it would only hit into or only be relevant in lobbies where there is undead. So I think that's a pretty neat change. Overall, a lot of these changes are just slight stat changes, so going to be kind of interesting to see how these unfold. The other one that I definitely want to talk about with Battlegrounds is Magma Lock. Now, this is like a half revert in a way. It's still a nerf, but Magma Lock, when it was introduced a couple of patches ago into Battlegrounds, it was a tier 4, I believe. It was a tier 4 1/1 for the base body, and then they bumped it up to a tier 5, but they added stats and made it a 3/3 to start. but it has been a little bit too strong at that point. So now they're just kind of reverting the stats on it to 1/1, but they're keeping it at that tier 5. But being both an elemental and Murloc definitely was a little bit strong. So might not be quite as strong there with those stats being at 1/1. Definitely some other changes here. Again, a lot of these changes are just kind of minor, like stat changes. The other big change as well is Greasebot, bringing this down from tier 6 to tier 4, and then decreasing its stats and decreasing the buffs that it gives. So kind of interesting there. There are duels changes. I do not personally play duels, so I definitely don't feel like I can address any of those. But the other things that I wanted to mention are down here in this bug fixes, which the big one, I think, especially for standard, is that first one, the updated Hawkstrider Rancher. Now says whenever instead of after. So it's a text-only change that it says, but this will impact specifically Unholy Death Knight and the interaction between the Rancher and the bodies that summon other bodies, right? So currently it is the Nerubian that summons the 1/3 taunts, and then you play it, and before this change, it was summoning the other 2 bodies alongside it, and then the Hawkstrider would give all of those the +1/+1 and the death rattle. Now, after this change, it will work whenever that is played. So it will, the Hawkstrider will only give the first body that you play that effect, and then 2 additional bodies will get summoned from that Nerubian. So pretty big change there. That is how it was from what I've been seeing and what it appeared on like Twitter from devs and stuff. That was kind of the intended interaction. So making sure that they change that wording so that it will apply that way moving forward. But that's pretty huge. Also, with the hit to the location, I do think that we will see a decrease, and we already have seen a decrease in the Unholy Death Knight. So that both of those changes affect that same deck. But that, for me, was something that it was put in bug fixes, but like that's a pretty big change, right? And then also something that had been talked about, but they did add the mech tag to the Purator, the Paladin card. So it is a mech now itself, which is pretty interesting. And I'm not sure how that will impact things going forward, if it will be played in multiple Paladin decks. That's kind of going to have to be, foreseen, but we'll see on that. But that's what we have for our changes, and that patch is in now. So pretty big changes here, but let me know what you think of these changes down below. And thank you so much for watching and checking this out, and I will see you in the next one.